You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
Good afternoon, Dolphins, and welcome to another episode, finally, of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I'm your host, Kevin Dern, back for another edition of off-season Dolphins Talk. Please give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, wherever else you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in. We're recording this one on a Wednesday afternoon, so there is no whiskey segment today, just a strawberry lemonade Celsius for those that are curious. But had a little bit of a hiatus after our last episode, and then my wife had sort of an unplanned vacation, which worked out pretty well. So we did some fun things with our two daughters and really just kind of lost track of time. And then once we got in the middle of OTAs and minicamp, I figured I'd just let the dust settle on everything and then sort of give my recap thoughts of the whole offseason process as we enter the doldrums. And I guess first, sorry to those fans of the Miami Heat and Florida Panthers. Tough way to go out in the NBA Finals and Stanley Cup Finals, respectively. While I am a Dolphins fan, I don't really have an NBA team, and I don't really have an NHL team. I guess if you had to pin one on me, my father used to work in Manhattan right before the Rangers won the Cup in 1994, and I kind of remember some of the players on that team. But don't really follow hockey. I'll watch the playoffs in the Stanley Cup Finals if I can, but really for me, this is typically the most boring time of the sports calendar because my beloved hometown Cincinnati Reds are typically pretty bad, and they were god-awful last year. This year, however, with an influx of new talent, young guys to go along with Jonathan India and Tyler Stevenson, they've been pretty exciting and are only 2.5 games out of first. But the NL Central is a bad division because the Reds are still 2 games below 500 and just 2.5 out of first. But if you get the chance, they do have a young kid that just called up, I guess about a week ago now, Ellie De La Cruz, who can play shortstop, third base, and is just a really fun player. Recorded the fastest time from home plate to third when he hit a triple a couple weeks ago, and like the second fastest time in the last 20 some years since they've been keeping track of that. His second night as a major leaguer hit like a 460-foot home run that almost left Great American Ballpark. So fun player to watch. And they've got another guy, Chris Encarnacion Strand, who reportedly might be getting called up soon. So they don't have the pitching to make a serious run this year, but it's a fun team. And you know, the Marlins are obviously doing well, so if you get the Reds coming down there to Miami, it's a fun team to watch play. But that aside, we're here to talk Dolphins football, and we sit a month and approximately 2 weeks away from the typical start of most training camps. So I figured it'd be a good time to kind of check in, give my thoughts on some of the big ticket items, and those items will be the combined two of them there, the Christian Wilkins extension talks, and then Connor Williams and Zach Sealer both did not participate in minicamp, different ways, but neither of them participated because they want new deals. We'll talk about Dalvin Cook and possibly other running backs, and then just kind of do a review of some of the bigger points of OTAs and minicamp. I know a couple people who were down there that got to cover those. We've traded some information. Some things I think a lot of Dolphins fans will be intrigued by, I guess is the right word. Some things that Dolphins fans may, kind of view as like an alarm bell. Not a red flag, but like, okay, maybe we need to watch this a little bit more closely. So the first big ticket item, Christian Wilkins, his extension. we've talked about this on the podcast for what seems like months now. Brought it up before the draft. We knew he wanted to stay in Miami. We knew Miami wants to keep him. And I've reported it. Barry Jackson has confirmed it. They've been in talks for quite a while now, and nothing has transpired to this point. But, kind of based on some of the tea leaves I've read from some of the reporters and some things that have been passed to me directly, it sort of seems like this is the big domino, if you will, that needs to fall before other business takes place. And it's one of those things where I think you get to this time period now. The Dolphins finished minicamp a week early. Most teams are doing minicamp this week or next week. The Dolphins have an extended time period between now and training camp compared to most of the other teams in the league. Typically, that's when you see that kind of work get done. And I think really the only other business that might get done before the Wilkins deal would be them signing second-round corner Cam Smith. Typically, the second-rounders, it's more of the offset language and how those kind of get slotted in. Because of the rookie pay scale, there's really no negotiation. He can't hold out and ask for way more money or something like that. But typically, it's those second-round picks that kind of slot in last, because there's that trickle-down effect of, okay, what is the guy who was the first one out of the first round getting as far as the offset language and stuff like that. So that might be the one piece of business they get done before Christian Wilkins. I don't have a timetable on when Christian Wilkins will get done. I just know that all sides want it done. And one of the talking points has been brought up is like the average annual value based on what guys like Dexter Lawrence and Daron Payne and Javon Hargrave have gotten. And I think that's a slight misnomer, because if you're paying Christian Wilkins an average annual value of, say, $20 million, there's different ways to structure that contract. He might have $10 million, $15 million in the first couple years, and then the final year it spikes to like $38 or $40 million. If it's over, say it's a 5-year, $100 million deal, you can cut it a number of ways, and the average will be $20 million per year. But you might have 2 or 3 years where that payout is $20 million or less, which is good for the team. Still a nice chunk of change for any player in the league. But I would look more at what the guaranteed money is and what the overall cash allocation to the player is when you look at the contracts. I do think that Miami, especially with Brandon Shore, does a great job of structuring deals to help them prepare for the future. Obviously, there's a lot of things they can do next year going into the 2024 season to manipulate the cap. So I think it's more or less just them finding a happy medium and then working out the structure of the contract is probably what the holdup is in my eyes at this point. I can't see Christian Wilkins being too outlandish with his demand, but I would certainly think he's well within his rights to ask for the similar amounts to Daron Payne and who am I thinking of? Who's the other one? Dexter Lawrence, his former Clemson teammate. Brain fart there. And I think a lot of people will say, well, he doesn't have the sack production or the pass rush production. My counterpoint to that would be is, at least under Brian Flores and Josh Boyer, look at how many times he was used as a pick player to free up someone else on a blitz or a stunt. How many times did he actually get to go one-on-one, full-out pass rushing, especially compared to the high percentage of snaps he plays versus some of those other guys? He's giving you way more reps. He was the number one run-stop win rate defender for defensive tackles in the entire league last year. If you use the ESPN metric, I think he was something like 4th if you go by Pro Football Focus. So one of, if not the best, run-stopping 3 technique in the league. And I don't think that's a stretch to say that. And when you look at this defense, we've talked about this multiple times, you're playing a four-man front, which is really 2 D tackles and 2 edge defenders, 2 edge linebackers, Chubb and Phillips, the guys who are going to be doing it the most, with 2 linebackers behind them with a lot of coverage responsibilities. You're really relying on your defensive tackles to be players against the run. And Miami did that last year, especially after the Bradley Chubb acquisition, that trade. Played a similar front to what you're going to see Fangio play a lot of this year. And they were the 4th best run defense in the entire league. Didn't allow a single running back over 100 yards the entire year. Only 2 players did get over 100 yards, Lamar Jackson and Justin Fields. So it's a pretty big linchpin, in my opinion, with Christian Wilkins. And, quite frankly, at least going back to Fangio's return to the NFL, when he followed Jim Harbaugh from Stanford to the 49ers, what was that, 2010, 2011, somewhere around there, 2011, I think. He's never really had an interior player the caliber of Christian Wilkins. I think the 2 closest guys you're going to get are Justin Smith when he was in San Francisco, who ended up being a pretty decent pass rusher after kind of being a bust in Cincinnati as a 4-3 D end. He fit well in Fangio's 3-4, but was never the stout run stopper that Wilkins is. I think the other guy that may be closer was when Fangio had Akeem Hicks in Chicago with the Bears. But Hicks is even more of a true nose tackle type build, 6'5", 320, 325, run plugger. And Wilkins' metrics are on par or better than Hicks were. So this is kind of the unicorn, so to speak, for Vic Fangio. And given the leadership capabilities, given how many snaps Wilkins plays, I think the team really needs to get this done, and I think that will free them up to do some more business. So hopefully that's something that'll transpire between now and the start of training camp or at the start of the season. I know there have been negotiations over the summer in the past with other players that have also sparked different deals with different players, so just keep that in mind. And on that note, we had 2 players not participate in the minicamp and OTAs because they want new deals from the Miami Dolphins. Now, they went about it 2 different ways. We'll start with Christian Wilkins' running mate, Zach Sealer, the D-tackle, who switched his agent this past year to Drew Rosenhaus. Obviously, a lot of familiarity with the Dolphins. Has multiple clients on the team. Just off the top of my head, I know he's done business with them in recent years. Emmanuel Ogbah is a client of his. Jerome Baker's a client of his. They've both gotten extensions done. So hopefully that's something that could be looked at after you get Christian Wilkins done. And Sealer skipped the OTAs, which, as a reminder, they are voluntary. They are not mandatory. They are voluntary. So he's well within his rights to do that. And he did show up to minicamp. So he was there, but did not participate during the minicamp stuff. We'll touch on Sealer here in a second, because I think the Wilkins domino has to fall first, and then I think the Connor Williams domino probably falls next before you get to Sealer. Now, I think Sealer's doing this I won't say there's a right or wrong way, but he's doing it the professional way, and he's never had a problem picking up different defenses. The front line stuff that you're going to see Fangio use is pretty similar to what Brian Flores and Josh Boyer used. He shouldn't have a problem picking up the defense and stepping right in and being the effective player that he was. Connor Williams, on the other hand, skipped minicamp and did not show up, so he took the fines. Mike McDaniel clearly intimated that he knew that was going to happen. And I also know that the Dolphins do love Connor Williams at center. That's why I kind of bristled at some of the notions that John Michael Schmitz would be a pick for them. He was on the board when they drafted Cam Smith. They went, didn't consider that because they like Connor Williams. And, Williams' situation is a little bit different. He signed a 2-year deal, so he kind of knew going into it that, you have 1 year and then +1 after it. So it's a little bit more puzzling, and I haven't looked up who his agent is, why he feels compelled to do that, other than if he really wants to stay in Miami, which seems to be the case because he wants a new deal. Then I can see his point, like, pay me now, I'll be happy now, and, you won't have to worry about me down the road when you've got to figure out, Tua Tagovailoa, Jalen Waddle, Jalen Phillips, Javon Holland, Kader Kohu eventually is going to want a big deal if he continues to play like he did last year and progress. So you've got some things on the horizon that you're going to have to look out for, and I think it's best for all parties to get Connor Williams done as well. Now, this was something that was kind of brought up on Twitter and on message boards. Well, what if you get one of the two between Connor Williams done and Zach Sealer done? This assumes that you've already got Wilkins done. But if you're in a bidding war between Williams and Sealer, can't you just franchise tag the other? So I looked into that, and very interestingly, the offensive line franchise tag does not have a distinction between offensive tackle, offensive guard, and center. However, in defensive line tags, there is a separate tag for defensive ends, edge players, and interior defensive linemen. Miami doesn't really get any help in this case because the defensive tackle, defensive interior franchise tag is only like $680,000 more than the offensive line franchise tag. So that's pretty much a null point. You're not saving much if you franchise one or the other. They're basically the same value. They're within $700,000 of value. I don't think you really want to pay Connor Williams or Zach Sealer like $18 million a year. It's like 18 and change for both of those, with a difference of like $680,000, somewhere around there. So you don't get much relief that way if you decide to franchise tag them. If you get Christian Wilkins done, because he is the better player, and this was another thing I've seen, who were the best players on the Dolphins last year. If you were picking a top 3, I think Tyreek Hill's probably the obvious number 1. I would have to put Christian Wilkins at 2, ahead of Teron Armstead, just because Armstead missed some time. And then maybe Jalen Waddle, Jalen Phillips would be the next 2 guys in line. And then Tua. But, again, Tua missed time and had a couple of rough games there towards the end of the season, which I would kind of set him back. But Zach Sealer's got to be in that conversation as well, I would think. So does Connor Williams. They both played really well. But I think Christian Wilkins was one of the top 2 or 3 players on the entire team last year. I think you have to do him before Zach Sealer. And then it becomes a question of roster cap allocation. Do you want to pay 2 defensive tackles, let's just call it $12+ million a year each? I think it may be worth it if you didn't have all these other high contracts available. And I wonder if that's kind of a thing where if you get Wilkins done and get Connor Williams done, do you have to wait until after the 2023 season where you can enact some mechanisms to free up more money to get a deal done with Zach Sealer? The obvious candidates is, I think you would have to look at restructuring Xavier Howard's contract in some capacity. Emmanuel Ogbah, either restructuring again or moving off. Jerome Baker, can come off the books next year for minimal hit. There's ways to do it. I think Cedric Wilson after this season becomes easier to move off of. So I wonder if it's a case to where you've got Wilkins on the near horizon, Connor Williams maybe a little bit after that, and then Zach Sealer's kind of that first buoy on the far horizon you come to during or after the 2023 season. Take a sip of the Celsius there. And then you have the Dalvin Cook situation. I would say first and foremost, if you're going to dive into this or you aren't as familiar with it, check out my friend Reason, who does the Finside the NFL show on YouTube. I've been on there a couple times, was on there this offseason, have been on there before for some of his panels and other shows. He has been on top of the Dalvin Cook situation really since there was news of it back earlier before the draft that Miami and Minnesota were in trade talks. I believe he was one of, if not the first, to report that, and that was true. Barry Jackson confirmed it later on, that there were trade discussions had. And Reason is very close with Nick Hicks, who you know as Tua's trainer, but he's also Dalvin Cook's trainer. He had Nick Hicks on the show, and essentially, I don't want to steal too much thunder from Reason, but it sounds like if you were to pay in that kind of $7 to $8 million range, let's just say it's a 1-year deal, that's probably the figure that Dalvin Cook is looking for. It's not the 10.4 or whatever he was going to be paid in Minnesota, but it's also more than I think Ian Rappaport was tweeting about this the other day. Like Miles Sanders got the biggest running back deal in free agency this offseason. It was like $6 million or $6.5 million. So it's more than that. And clearly Dalvin Cook's a much more prolific player than a Miles Sanders and would be a fit here. But you kind of see these breadcrumbs dropped. Reason talked about this. Chris Kaufman from the 3 yards per carry had tweeted about it this morning. Dalvin wants to go to a team that's going to feed him the ball. He wants to go to a team that's going to pay him what he's worth. Neither of those things kind of spark the obvious tie into Miami, even though he is from Miami, at least in my eyes, because we never really saw a bell cow type back emerge under Mike McDaniel last year. Maybe a couple games with Raheem Mostert, but they threw the ball so much that you're never really going to get that guy that's getting 15 plus carries regularly. And now you have Mostert back, you have Jeff Wilson back, you've added Devon Achane to the room. Savon Ahmed got a little bit of run late in the season and had some impressive plays. It just seems pretty crowded. And Miami structured, other than Devon Achane, who was drafted, all of the other running backs who they brought back from last year structured their contracts in ways that are easily removable from the roster right now. If you were to sign Dalvin Cook this afternoon, you could get rid of Mostert, Wilson, Gaskin, Ahmed, whichever one you wanted, and there's virtually no cap hit to you. So there's flexibility there, but even then, if you remove one or even two from the equation, it still seems like a pretty crowded backfield based on what Dalvin Cook has talked about. And, Chris Kaufman brought up this point. Leonard Fournette was on Good Morning Football, and they had asked him a question about Jalen Ramsey and their time together in Jacksonville. And they asked him, who had the best roster in the league, and Leonard Fournette said the Dolphins. So I wonder if that's kind of sending up a smoke flare, signal flare of some sort on his end. And Chris Kaufman made the point, like, Miami had some issues last year running in short yardage. And the game that comes to mind immediately is that Saturday night loss in Buffalo, where Miami threw it a couple times on 3rd and short and didn't get it. And Chris Kaufman had a pretty great stat about Fournette, usage on like 3rd and 4th and short. He's had like 30 attempts, has converted it 18 times, and he's never lost yardage on any of those runs. just is pretty unbelievable to me. So maybe there's other options out there that are more affordable. That's, again, big if here. If Miami's still looking to add a running back after adding Devon Achane to the room. Be curious to see what happens between now and training camp, because, Vic Fangio had some media availability, and this will tie into our review of OTAs and minicamp segment here in a minute. But he dropped a line that said, there's certain positions we feel good about, and I'm paraphrasing, certain positions we feel good about, certain positions we've got to go find talent, which is kind of an odd phrasing. But we'll dive into that when we talk about some of the OTA and minicamp nuggets here. So the first big point, and let's just get this out of the way, was Tua and the helmet cam, which sometimes this fan base just drives me up a wall. I love Dolphins fans, but there are some contemptibly stupid ones out there, and they know who they are, who are trying to use or tried to use the helmet cam as a way to, push the Tua sucks narrative further, and you just don't feed into that. Multiple teams use helmet cams. They've been used since the 1960s. I believe the Broncos in '63 were the first team to implement it. Tom Brady's used it before. Multiple QBs. You can Google it. I'm sure you can find pictures of it. The Arizona Cardinals, when Carson Palmer was there, literally built a room for virtual reality training. Yes, virtual reality training. There's a Sports Illustrated article about it from like 2013 or something, about how he trained and prepared. It's just funny because, and I think one point is, all the media members are, it's allowing McDaniel to see where Tua's eyes go. Yes, that's true to a degree, but you can still move your eyes and keep your head facing one direction and look the other. It's not hard. Everyone can do it. So just much ado about nothing there. McDaniel even kind of said it's more about audio learning, hearing Tua call the plays so receivers and younger players can hear how he talks and makes the play calls, rather than let's nitpick every, Tua throw. And kind of one of the interesting things is of the people I talked to that were at OTAs and minicamp, a lot of them didn't really have many notes about Tua because he played at a high level and it just has sort of become routine. You don't hear any articles about the 5 interception day or batted passes or missing throws. Most of the nuggets I heard about quarterback play were just kind of like, yeah, Tua's Tua, but we've got an issue. Mike White didn't look that great by all accounts. Skylar Thompson didn't look that great by all accounts, which kind of jives, to their past NFL performances. But I do wonder if Tua misses an extended period, is Miami right back in the same boat they were last year, where they don't win a game unless he's the quarterback on the field? I'd like to think Mike White is capable, and having played in a very similar system last year with the Jets, of being that guy. But I can't help but wonder if someone like an Andy Dalton may have been a better fit for a little bit more money. So just something to keep an eye on, especially if you go to training camp and get to attend the practices, which, I'd love to go down there and sweat my ass off for a few days and watch, but I won't be able to make it this year, not with 2 little ones here at the house. But just something to watch if you get to go. Watch and see how close or how far apart Skylar Thompson is to Mike White, and then collectively how look at the difference between Tua's level of play and what the drop-off is compared to those two guys. And, was Teddy Bridgewater somewhere in the in-between last year at his best? That was kind of the one takeaway about quarterbacks that kind of made me pause. Nothing, bad about Tua. It was just Tua's Tua. It's routine. He's doing what he's supposed to do. He's getting the ball out. It doesn't really matter who lines up there. Tyreek Hill was there but was limited in some of the minicamp stuff. He went on vacation during a couple of the OTAs. Doesn't really matter. Tua was doing what Tua did last year. Good stuff. The offensive line was kind of the next big ticket item, and I will protect my source on this. I know what the lineup that was used the most by the first team was, and it would surprise a lot of people. But we got the two revelations that Liam Eichenberg being cross-trained at center, and to me that feels a lot like the treatment that Michael Dieter got from the Brian Flores staff going from 2019 to 2020. Like, hey, you're not an NFL guard. We're going to have you learn how to play center and develop and kind of take a redshirt year. And I say that because I will share, and this has been confirmed other places as well, Isaiah Wynn was the first team left guard. Now, keep in mind, Connor Williams missed minicamp and did not show at OTAs. Teron Armstead was at OTAs, but he's still recovering from, we'll just say, some offseason medical stuff. He should be fine for the start of camp. So it was a little bit of a jumbled offensive line. But Isaiah Wynn was the starting left guard, not right tackle, not left tackle, but left guard. He's also switched his jersey number to 77 if you're keeping score or want to keep your roster updated for training camp. 77 was what he wore at the University of Georgia. He is that now with the Dolphins, not 71. So interesting that he was the first team left guard, and Eichenberg, not Dan Feeney, who they signed this offseason, got work as the first team center in the wake of Connor Williams' absence. So just another battle to kind of keep your eye on is who's going to be the backup center. Is it Eichenberg? Is it Dan Feeney? Is there a guard that they like, and that's why they've moved Eichenberg to center? They want someone else to be the top backup interior guard player. Presumably Robert Jones is at the top of the list, I would imagine. But an interesting one to kind of keep an eye on. And again, Teron Armstead should be fine at camp. I'm sure he's going to get plenty of veteran rest days. The dude barely practiced last year and was mostly phenomenal when he was on the field, other than maybe the Chargers game. He's just got to hopefully stay on the field more. The linebacking room made some news. You've got quite a few edge linebackers that are going to be on the team that automatically, barring an injury. Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips, Emmanuel Ogba's going to get some snaps there, also playing inside at defensive line in some of the formations. You're going to see Malik Reed. You're going to see Andrew Van Ginkel there in some capacity. But it was also put out there that Van Ginkel was getting reps at inside linebacker. And some of the reason for that is because Channing Tindall had an injury and while he was present at minicamp did not participate. And then David Long was nursing an injury, only participated in the individual drills. So Van Ginkel got some reps. And I will share that, Jerome Baker was always with the ones, but sometimes he was partnered with Duke Riley. Sometimes he was partnered with Andrew Van Ginkel. But then when you go to some of the other drills that are non-team, it was Baker and David Long. So that seems kind of like what your rotation is going to be. As far as Channing Tindall goes, you'd like to see some positivity about him. He certainly would seem to have the athleticism and the range and the blitzing prowess to be a factor in this defense. But right now he kind of feels like the fifth guy, and I don't know that they would necessarily keep five, but I think David Long Jr., Jerome Baker, those are your starters. You're probably going to see Van Ginkel slot in there in some of their base looks, the 3-4 stuff, with Duke Riley as a top backup and special teams guy, and then maybe Tyndall is the next one. Also a point of caution, a lot of people talked about Mitchell Agude, the outside linebacker from the University of Miami, having a really nice camp. Whenever you hear stories like that, especially about undrafted guys or defenders who are everywhere, you've got to keep in mind two things. Number one, none of it's full pads and full contact. So that's more the barometer. If he's still doing that when we get the pads on in camp, okay. The other thing is, and you don't always get access to this because of the muzzle that's put on the beat writers, but you can look through some of the videos and pictures and stuff and kind of figure it out. He's not doing that stuff against the ones. It's more against the 2s and 3s. And that kind of seems like, it's the flavor du jour every year in the preseason. There's always one player, especially defensive linemen or edge players, that the Dolphins fans seem to really hype up. And you look at it and you're like, well, yeah, this guy's beating a third-team tackle that's never going to make the Raiders roster or whatever your example would be. But like you go back and, Julius Wormsley, A.J. Francis, last year was Porter Gustin. There's always like one of these guys that has a flash rep in a game or a practice and then never materializes. Cameron Good last year as well. So I'll just put that out there as kind of a cautionary speed bump about Mitchell Agude. Let's wait and see if he's doing this when the pads come on, and let's wait and see if they spoon feed him any reps against the ones. That's kind of the barometer, because preseason is so vanillaed and dumbed down. It's more about one-on-one evaluations versus like what the team is doing. You don't see much scheme being used or game planning being used. So even then, if you see a guy that's like, just wrecking shop on the D line or, beating a tackle off the edge, that's a 2 or a 3, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to earn snaps with the ones. It's just kind of, it is what it is. But an interesting note nonetheless that, with Van Ginkel being able to slide it to the inside off-ball position, that kind of gives you a roster flexibility component. Maybe you get to keep one less linebacker or edge player because Van Ginkel can do both, and Jerome Baker to a degree. You might be able to add an extra DB or keep an extra receiver or running back or tight end, something like that. So just an important thing to factor into the roster math. And then the secondary play. Miami's got the names upon names. Jalen Ramsey, Xavier Howard, Kader Kohu, Cam Smith, all at corner, all looked pretty good by every account that I heard. Javon Holland at safety, Fangio spoke pretty glowingly of him. He was about the only player specifically mentioned by Fangio during his 4-minute media availability. So that probably bodes well. But the thing that was interesting is you had a lot of other guys who are reportedly going to be worked at safety that weren't able to participate. Brandon Jones still not cleared back from his injury. Nick Needham was still not back. Trill Williams still not back. And then Deshaun Elliott picked up an injury and did not participate in minicamp. So as best I can piece together, Verone McKinley and Elijah Campbell were the guys paired with Javon Holland in those minicamp practices. You're probably not pairing those guys with him too much in the regular season games. So that's kind of one area where you wonder, okay, are we going to get enough guys healthy enough and get them through camp to the regular season? Because remember, Brandon Jones and Nick Needham's injuries were mid-season. They're not like a year out from those injuries until like week 6 and 7 respectively. So that might be a place where, maybe you look at anybody who's cut, or if there's a free agent out there that you might want to pick up. And then I still kind of wonder about the interior defensive line. Obviously you've got Christian Wilkins, Raekwon Davis, who apparently looked a little bit better. Zach Sealer, who will probably play good soldier and show up to training camp. Josiah Bronson got in, I think, 1 game or 2 games last year. But beyond that, Emmanuel Ogba's in that group too. Although he, like Van Ginkel, he will play with the interior line and then can also play outside at the true edge spots. But there's really not much proven depth as a backup like nose tackle or even kind of a 3-4 end other than Emmanuel Ogba on the roster. You've got Brandon Pilley, the undrafted free agent out of USC, Josiah Bronson, and then Jalen Twyman, who I think ended up getting an injury in minicamp. So, interesting spots to keep an eye on for potential adds, potential cuts, and waiver wire stuff once we get to training camp. Again, my point of caution is when these kind of unheralded names get mentioned, pay attention to who they're getting reps with and who they're getting reps against. Last year, I think Braylon Sanders is a good example of this offensively. Had some nice reps in one-on-one drills and 7-on-7 stuff when Tua was throwing him the ball, but never seemed to be with the ones during team drills, and then kind of disappeared during the preseason games and ended up on the practice squad. Got called up for a couple games, but, interesting stuff there. And I think that's a good stopping point for this week's Dolphins Talk Weekly podcast. Again, I'm your host, Kevin Dern. Please give me a follow on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on Spotify, iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since it is Father's Day this weekend, I don't think we'll have a show this weekend, but hopefully we'll have a show here in the next week or two as sort of a training camp primer, maybe go over some of the positional battles I think are key to making this Dolphins roster for 2023 the best possible roster it can be. So with that in mind, everyone have a great rest of your week. To the dads out there, happy Father's Day this weekend, and fins up.